Good afternoon. I'm not on your program anywhere, so if you look through it and try to figure out who I am, you won't see it. My name is Tim Ryan, and I am, actually I'm here in a dual role. I'm the Chancellor at the University of New Orleans, which is one of the partners in sponsoring this event, and I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees of the National World War II Museum, and would like to welcome all of you to this event. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator, the host of this session, Dr. Alan Millett. It's especially a privilege for me to, this is sort of Alan's first coming out. Alan is the director of the Eisenhower Center for American Studies and a professor of history at the University of New Orleans. You may be aware of the fact, or you may not, that Dr. Stephen Ambrose started this National World War II Museum, then called the D-Day Museum. Stephen Ambrose, at the time he started that museum, was the director of the Eisenhower Center for American Studies. So Alan is following in very large footsteps, and Alan is capable of continuing Steve's work and pushing the frontiers here at the National World War II Museum. Dr. Millett just recently joined the University of New Orleans from the Ohio State University. Go Bucks. We both happen to be graduates of the Ohio State University, so any Michigan fans in the audience, you'll have a bad day on Saturday, we hope. Dr. Millett graduated in 1959 from DePauw University and received his graduate degrees in 1966 and 69, respectively, from the Ohio State University. He is a historian of great renown. I did, as we all do in today's world, I Googled Alan, and it sent me to Amazon.com, where he had 3 pages of books. 3 pages that are currently being sold on Amazon.com. I thought it was interesting, and I looked at one of the books, which is about World War II, title of A War to Be Won, Fighting the Second World War by Alan Millett and Williamson Murray. And you know how they have those reviews that are just random. These are not the one that you put on your book covers, your book jackets. They're just random readers. And I thought the reviews were very interesting. Review of A War to Be Won. This is the best single book on World War II. I have shelves of World War II books in my libraries in Montana, Ohio, and I served in World War II for 3 years in the ETO. This volume is indispensable. It provides the big picture of the overall war and offers insights into strategies and leaderships that are most revealing. Very readable, well documented. It is essential for anyone obsessed with World War II. A second reviewer says, without a doubt, A War to Be Won is an impressive achievement from a historian's perspective. It is quite simply the best one-volume military history of World War II that I've come across. This book benefits from much recent scholarship from hitherto, I like guys who use hitherto in reports, hitherto unknown primary sources in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Those in search of a splendid one-volume military history of World War II need look no further. I think, and that's just from one of Alan's books. He is a specialist on the Korean War. Being a Marine veteran, he has written the history of the Marines. He has won a large number of prizes in his academic career. And we here in New Orleans and at the University of New Orleans at the National D-Day Museum are delighted to have him here. I'd like to introduce Alan Millett.
A special contribution of the Eisenhower Center and the University of New Orleans, and a pledge of our continued association and support of the work of the National World War II Museum. I'm going to give Chancellor Ryan a book which will be available to all of you back in the stall area, whatever we call it. This is a bibliography of World War II that, mostly in English, that represents 15 years of scholarship as compiled by the World War II Studies Association, Kansas State University. Mark Prillo, president of that organization, made this available to us, pro bono publico, and the university and the Eisenhower Center are making that available to you. So get them while they're free. But Tim, you get the second one because Moira Ambrose got the first, which seems to be appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bateman, who is here representing the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Bob not only has a distinguished military career, but is also a degree holder of the Ohio State University, and is also the author of a very fine book on No-Gun Re, which goes a long way to clearing up some of the misimpressions spread by the AP book. So Bob, it's all yours.
I'm here today to give an award from the Secretary of Defense to Dr. Murray and Dr. Millett. But I want to say something a little more personal beyond the static words on the page. I think everybody in this room agrees military history is vitally important for our national security. Understanding how wars were fought in the past is critical for us professionals to understand how to get things right in the future. Dr. Murray and Dr. Millett together created a program at The Ohio State University which has no rivals on this continent and arguably on the planet. There are very many fine historical programs, academic programs in this country. But when you get into the specialized field of academic history and you learn, if you want to know about diplomatic history, you go to one university. If you want to learn about economic, you go to another university. And eventually those universities gather reputations because it takes a critical mass of faculty. It takes more than just one fine, outstanding faculty member in a particular field to make that university outstanding. Starting with Dr. Murray and Millett, Ohio State University began developing that, bringing in more faculty members so that eventually there was a critical mass reached. Enough of the faculty members were military historians that it allowed other historians who didn't normally specialize in military history to examine issues of military history related to their own fields. And so now at Ohio State, it's not uncommon for the business historian to also write some military history about the economics of the Second World War. The true importance of that for the defense industry, for the Department of Defense, is the intellectual value that Dr. Murray and Millett have handed to the nation. Together, their intellectual contributions represent a very real national resource. And so without further ado, I'd like to read the citation. Dr. Millett.
Wick and I are going to try to remember how to stand at attention.
This is a citation to accompany the award of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service to Alan R. Millett. Dr. Alan Millett is recognized for outstanding public service as a military author and professor of military history, supporting the Office of the Director, Net Assessment, and the Department of Defense from July 1968 to November 2006. Dr. Millett taught at a number of military institutions, including the Korean National Defense University, and served as an adjunct faculty member at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. He also acted as an academic mentor to generations of professional Army officers working towards advanced degrees in military history at The Ohio State University, prior to becoming academics in their own right at the United States Military Academy. His sustained efforts resulted in the writing and publication of more than 23 books and several dozen articles and chapters for anthologies on topics ranging from military history to culture, technology, innovation, and strategy. He directed special studies of great value to the Director, Net Assessment, and the Secretary of Defense, and these studies are now widely used throughout the United States Armed Forces professional military education system. The distinctive accomplishments of Dr. Millett reflect great credit upon himself and the Department of Defense.
Hope this isn't an expensive suit. Okay.
Citation to accompany the award of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service to Dr. Williamson Murray. Dr. Murray is recognized for outstanding public service as military author and historian supporting the Office of the Director, Net Assessment, and Department of Defense from April 1971 to November 2006. Dr. Murray taught at a number of military institutions, including the Air War College, the United States Military Academy, the Naval War College, and the Army War College. He authored more than 23 books and several dozen articles on military history, culture, technology, innovation, and strategy. Many of his books and articles are required reading at the United States military academic institutions and at several foreign institutions. Through his writing, Dr. Murray significantly contributed to the understanding of the impact of warfare and the conditions required toward maintaining peace. For more than 15 years, he directed special studies of great value for the Director of Net Assessment and the Secretary of Defense, and these studies are now widely used throughout the United States Armed Forces professional military education system. The distinctive accomplishments of Dr. Murray reflect great credit upon himself and the Department of Defense.
Well, the circus continues. My pleasure to introduce our panel. Wick Murray, you've already heard. He's known throughout the world as Bomber Murray. So one expects him, of course, to speak about the air war, the American side of the air war. To Wick's right is another dear friend and former graduate student of mine, Professor Malcolm Kip Muir, who's now the Biggs Professor of Military History at the Virginia Military Institute, where he also presides over a small and growing empire of military studies. At Kip's right is, again, one of my best friends and a delightful graduate student, Mike Dubler, author of a classic book called Closing with the Enemy, which Steve Ambrose said was one of the best or the best book about how the war was really fought in the European theater by the American forces. Mike is a retired colonel, United States Army National Guard, West Point graduate, and now is almost the author of a preference for doing studies for the National Guard, of which he's now done, what, 3-4 books, Mike? And so he represents the ground force perspective. Kip will talk about the American participation in the naval war, for which he's done a great deal of research, written 3 books, and has served as the Secretary of the Navy's high guru of naval warfare. I never thought the Cumberland River, was the place, but after all, Admiral Nimitz was from Fredericksburg, Texas, so you just can't tell. But in any event, we're really delighted to have these 3 very, very fine historians and great guys here to talk about America's participation, particularly operationally, in the Second World War. Wick, you've got the floor.
You want us to sit down here? Or?
Yeah, you can stay there, sure.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm supposed to discuss the American approach to World War II in the air, and I thought I might start off with a story which some of the audience may have heard me tell before, but I see a lot of strange faces out there, so it's certainly worth telling. In April 1938, Winston Churchill was in the middle of a debate in the House of Commons about the need for more air defense, with which, from one of the back benches, a pro-appeaser MP shouted out, "How much is enough?" Churchill paused for a moment. He said, "Well, That reminds me of the man who received a telegram from Brazil. The telegram said, "Your mother-in-law dead, wire instructions." Churchill paused for a moment and said, the man wired back, "Embalm, cremate, bury at sea, take no chances." And in fact, very much so, I think the American approach to the war in the air was one that aimed at taking no chances. Quite literally in terms of the productive capacity, the technological skill, the cultural aspects of American society at the time. Air war was the ideal form of war for Americans. Before the war, the Army Air Corps, the father and ancestor of the Army Air Forces during the Second World War, very clearly believed that air war would involve precision bombing, that it would, by taking out a few special nodes, what we'd call today precision warfare, destroy the German or Japanese economy in relatively short order, bringing the whole thing crashing down with relatively small expenditure of air crews and aircraft. In effect, what they were arguing was that air war would make impossible the terrible attrition that had marked the First World War in terms of the trenches. They didn't get that war. What they got was a terrible war of attrition in which, in the final analysis, what really mattered were numbers of aircraft and numbers of air crew and a capacity to sustain both production and the projection of air power units across two huge oceans. And I think one of the sort of terrible ironies and misuses of history that occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s was the praise for the German way of war, which entirely missed the fact that the Germans were appallingly bad at what I would call two crucial elements in warfare: logistics and intelligence. Appallingly bad. We who received the American military huge amounts of criticism from historians and from military reformers for the, quote, overemphasis on logistics during the Second World War, the critics missed entirely the fact that projecting military power across the Pacific and across the Atlantic demanded and required an emphasis on logistics first, before one could talk about operational and tactical excellence. And that is certainly what we got right. At the beginning, in terms of when American senior leaders began in the late 1938 to think about the problems of air war and an expansion of the American military, there is a wonderful exchange that occurred the first time that George Marshall, then the Assistant Chief of Staff of the Army, met Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was sort of declaiming about the need for 10,000 aircraft, without mentioning for a second the training programs, the logistical support, the air bases that were going to be required. And very clearly, Marshall made it very clear to the president that this approach was not going to be satisfactory. And I think in terms of Roosevelt's capacity to understand first-class military leadership as well as to understand the problems of war, nothing makes it more clear than the fact that 1 year later, maybe 11 months later, George Marshall found himself as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, where he was to play an absolutely crucial role in the development of American air power in terms of the Army Air Corps and Army Air Forces. The crucial moment in terms of the Second World War and crucial strategic decisions, very much influenced by the cultural attitudes and national attitudes, came in the 1940-1941 period. And from the point of view of the United States, The decisions made in 1941 reflected what was seen to be, quite correctly, as a quite surprising and stunning, at least from what people thought about air power and about the size of air forces, the British victory in the Battle of Britain. Very clearly, in July 1940, the estimate of virtually everybody in the United States, certainly virtually all of the Germans, and all of the most of the British, was that the Luftwaffe had a huge advantage over the British in what was to be called the Battle of Britain. In fact, of course, the British won that, not by a huge margin, although it's hard to see what the Luftwaffe would have done with any larger success. It's very difficult for me to picture the Wehrmacht crossing the English Channel in Rhine River barges. Nevertheless, the conclusion of the Luftwaffe, drawn by Americans and British airmen by the Luftwaffe's defeat in the summer and fall of 1940, was that a very large air force had been defeated, when in fact we know that in comparison to the kinds of air forces that would appear on the European scene in 1943 and 1944, it was a relatively small air force. Nevertheless, the result of this overestimation of German capabilities and the size of the Luftwaffe resulted in the casting of both British and American air plans, enormous production, and particularly in terms of the United States, production targets for 1943 and 1944. The fact, of course, there's a huge advantage that the United States enjoyed in what was to be a massive battle of attrition was the fact that American territory, as Professor Weinberg pointed out today, was never under attack during the Second World War. So that Ford Motor Company could build a factory at Willow Run in Michigan that was 2 miles long, that started off with the tail of a B-29, and out the other end came a whole B-29. The mass production, as one British historian of the strategic bombing offensive has quite accurately said, the Americans produced bombers like cans of beans. And we did, and the result of this, I think, in terms of targets for both naval air production and Army Air Forces production, was that by 1943 we were able to wage a huge air battle of attrition both in the Pacific and in Europe. The Pacific one was very clearly won by the summer of 1943 in the Solomons. The one in Europe was not to be won until April of May of 1944. But those battles of attrition had a whole series of other fallouts which had huge effect on the course of the Second World War. Let me pause for a second, mention here that Hitler's declaration of war in the United States on December 11th, 1941 was very clearly the worst strategic decision of the whole war, one which I think it's well worth underlining reflected not just Adolf Hitler's ignorance and stupidity, but that of the German military as well. In fact, in the summer of 1941, the Kriegsmarine had been urging enthusiastically on Hitler the idea of declaring war in the United States. In December of 1941, there is no mention of the declaration of war on the United States in the Howder diaries, and the Luftwaffe, with the one exception perhaps of Erhard Milch, could have cared less. In fact, the German understanding of the threat the United States and its production capabilities represented at this time is suggested by a meeting that occurred on the 8th of December 1941, where apparently Adolf Hitler, who was facing some somewhat dismal news about the fact that the entire Army Group Center might go down the drain in front of Moscow, was delighted by the news that Pearl Harbor had been attacked with enormous success by his Aryan allies, and called together the entire staff at Rastenburg to celebrate this event. And in the middle of their celebration, the Fuhrer asked his assembled 40 to 50 generals and staff officers where Pearl Harbor was. and not a single one of them knew. Yeah, and for people who are planning to conquer the world, this seems to have been somewhat of an oversight. But let me make a few other comments, because of course there is a tendency of historians, including myself perhaps, to over-focus on the issues of strategic bombing, both in the Pacific and in the European theater of operations. And I think it's well worth underlining and emphasizing that air power's contribution to the war was not in single areas, but in a whole diffuse and wide-ranging spectrum of major battles. The Battle of the Atlantic could very clearly not have been won in as early as May of 1943 without the contribution of air power. And it is very clearly that one of the major mistakes made in 1942 and early 43 was the consistent refusal of the bomber barons to turn over 4-engine bomber aircraft to the battle against the U-boats, because they were a major helper. Air superiority, essential both for the success of the landings in the Mediterranean theater of operations, not to mention Normandy, and certainly in terms of the Pacific, what the Army Air Forces under General Kenney for MacArthur and the naval air off of the carriers was able to do for Nimitz in 43 and 1944, sped up the whole course of the Pacific War enormously. So air superiority was as important as strategic bombing. And let me also say along those lines that interdiction, the course and success of U.S. air power and its contribution to the battle in northern France was enormous for the period of April 1944 through the eventual collapse of the Germans in Normandy in early August of 1944. The fact that it took the 2nd SS Panzer Division nearly 2 weeks to reach the Normandy frontier when it should have taken them only 3 or 4 days, again underlines the contribution made by American and British air power to the battle, to the land battle. In the end, of course, air power was not decisive by itself, the way so many had claimed before the war. Strategic bombing itself, I think we are beginning to understand how important a role it played, obviously in terms of gaining air superiority, in terms of the transportation plan, first of all against the Germans in Normandy, and then particularly as one of Professor Weinberg's students has underlined, the transportation effort played a crucial role in breaking the German economy by February of 1945. I think we should also not lose sight of the fact that even when it was not particularly successful, the strategic bombing of Germany in 1941, 1942 was essential to underlining to everybody in Europe, especially including the Germans, that the war was not over and that there was going to be a day when they were going to be paid back. One, of course, can quarrel with the division of resources. Air power was a key piece in the puzzle, in the projection of American military power across 2 oceans. And particularly, let me say in conclusion, it was crucial because it was particularly up the alley of American society, American culture, and particularly the American economy. Thank you very much.
I'm to talk about the United States Navy, and let me say simply that the United States Navy was the most successful major military organization in World War II, indeed perhaps even in all of modern times. Few services have foreseen so closely what sort of war they would have to fight, develop the tools and techniques that they would need to pursue the war successfully. No service, after some initial hard knocks, some bad setbacks, compiled such an unbroken string of success as the United States Navy did from 1943 to 1945. And no service of any country came out of a major conflict with such an extraordinary margin of superiority over any possible competitor. This is a remarkable story, and it was a story that in some ways played in the background. The Army, the Air Force often received more attention from the press. But the success of the Navy, please make no mistake about it, the Navy's successes could not guarantee victory. But the Navy's success was absolutely preconditional to achieving victory. If you could not win in the Atlantic against the German submarines, you were never going to be able to mount a strategic bombing campaign against the Germans, let alone to invade the continent. The same, of course, is true in the Pacific. For a little background about the visualizing what sort of war the the Navy would have to fight. The Navy, as early as 1919, decided that Japan was the most likely probable enemy. It didn't take a genius to figure this out, but it did take considerable foresight to calculate how you would come to grips with a country like Japan, a country whose Navy was a fine Navy, a Navy that was almost 70% as big as the United States Navy, a Navy that would be a very tough foe. It was particularly hard to calculate how you would push your bases forward. World War I seemed to prove to anybody that amphibious landings, opposed amphibious landings, were impossible. Gallipoli was, of course, the great nightmare. And yet the Marines, I'm going to fold the Marines in here with the Navy because they are a sea service, right? The Marines, under the Commandant, Major General Jean Lejeune, the Marines began planning for amphibious operations as early as 1921 and 22. Additionally, the Navy, looking at the broad reaches of the Pacific, the Navy realized early how important air power was. You'll hear some people claim that the mossback members of the gun club, that is the big battleship admirals, were opposed to naval air. I can guarantee you that's not correct. There was no one in the upper reaches of the United States Navy that said air was not important. The question always was how much of the pie, the budget pie, did air get? But look at how the United States Navy pioneered key aspects of aviation. The first plane to fly across the Atlantic was not the Spirit of St. Louis, it was the NC-4 in 1919. The first big carriers, truly successful big carriers, were Lexington and Saratoga. The Navy goes exactly in the opposite direction that the British went. When the British set up the Royal Air Force, they dragged British naval aviation kicking and screaming into this service that disregarded naval aviation. The U.S. Navy avoided that trap. The United States Navy set up the Bureau of Aeronautics in 1921 and developed its own air arm. All you have to do is to look at the contrast between carrier aircraft of the Royal Navy in 1939 and carrier aircraft of the United States Navy to realize how much more successful the U.S. Navy was with its own bureaucracy. In other ways, the Navy, in the interwar years, laid out the foundations for its great success. Some of the ship designs are classics: the Iowa-class battleships, the Essex-class carriers, Fletcher-class destroyers, heavy cruisers, and so on. These were designed pre-war. They would perform very successfully during the war. Now, there is a debit side to the ledger here. The Navy didn't get everything right. It didn't give enough attention to anti-submarine warfare. It gave too much attention to big bore gunnery, to the battleships, too much attention in retrospect. The Navy's torpedoes were mediocre. The Navy's submarine doctrine was off. But this This litany of woes could be applied to virtually any of the major navies. Hardly anybody got it all right. Now, in World War II, the Navy was going to have to fight two distinctly different wars. The war in the Atlantic was a different kettle of fish from the war in the Pacific. In the Atlantic, we were fighting essentially an anti-submarine warfare effort. In the Pacific, we were fighting a Navy that was strong in the air, on the surface, and under the sea. You know, to go ahead without giving credit to the leaders who built this extraordinary organization, starting at the top, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet, Ernest J. King. Those people, King wasn't well known during World War II. He's vanished from the popular memory. Further on down, people like Spike Blandy, for example, John Towers. These are names that didn't resonate then.
King was
But well-oiled machinery frequently is not the kind of machinery that attracts the attention. It's the mechanism like the Luftwaffe built by Hermann Goering that attracts attention, right? The Navy was going to take, of course, a quantum leap upward in terms of personnel strength and in terms of numbers of ships. Let's use personnel strength. Numbers can sometimes be eloquent. The United States Navy in 1939 was about 130,000 officers and men. By 1945, by VJ Day, the United States Navy was 3,400,000. Something like a 19-fold increase. Folded into it was, of course, the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard in 1945 was bigger than the United States Navy had been in terms of personnel in 1939. And ships. Fleet Admiral King noted, I'd like to quote him, "The magnificent productive capacity of the United States has given us the greatest Navy in history." That in some ways is practically an understatement. Just to give two examples. U.S. shipyards finished 10 fast battleships during the war. The North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, and the Iowas. That was more than the shipyards of Italy, Japan, and Germany completed put together. Or the ships that truly mattered for sea control, aircraft carriers. During World War II, the United States shipbuilding industry constructed 27 fleet carriers and 76 escort carriers, giving the United States, by VJ Day, 103 aircraft carriers. Again, in contrast, the Japanese completed 8 carriers during the war. This is one of the great weights on the balance beam of World War II. These were tough ships, as Franklin and Bunker Hill proved, for example, as submarines proved. Oh, just parenthetically, we build so many submarines. Congress authorizes so many submarines that we run out of fish names. And an ichthyologist at Harvard was asked by the man in the Navy Department who was in charge of naming ships, "Now, we have to come up with more fish names. If you were to find a new fish, what would you call it?"
That's a good story.
Now, adding great power to this muscle was the wedding of Navy ordnance labs with civilian institutions of higher education, like MIT, like Caltech, like Johns Hopkins. And coming out of that wedding, improvements in radar, which the Navy had already been working on, but the variable time fuse, some people call it the VT or the proximity fuse, homing torpedoes, the whole field of statistical analysis is applied to anti-submarine warfare with great results. And better planes. To dovetail here with Wick's comments, American aviation industry during World War II produces 38,000 planes for the United States Navy by 1944. This is bigger than the Luftwaffe had, or the Japanese Army and Naval Air Arms combined. Combat, we have setbacks in the Atlantic. Everybody knows about the first 6 months of the war in the Atlantic. It's a mess. The Navy's reaction to the German submarine offensive Operation Drumbeat off the eastern coast of the United States and in the Gulf was tardy. We lose too much there. But following that, the United States Navy becomes adept at anti-submarine warfare, as I say, puts new weapons to use. By 1943, we, and I'm using the we here in the big sense, because this is a combined war. Without giving credit to the Canadians and the British, we are simply giving an incomplete picture. American anti-submarine warfare assets, whether it's air or surface, sink about a third of the German submarines lost during World War II, about a third. But let me mention to you, the German anti-submarine force, which was innovative in its own right, the German submarine force, which sent to sea approximately 880 submarines on one or more war patrols. 781 of those were sunk, most with all hands. The submarine by 1944 was a nuisance, not a menace, really, although the Type 21 parenthetically promised other problems. Going ashore in Europe, the Navy, of course, escorts the troop ships across and lands the troops that would invade North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and D-Day, Western Europe. I think it's enlightening to look at the other side of the hill for just a second. Wick talked about the effects of air power on stifling the ability of the Germans to move rapidly on the ground during the daytime. Within range of naval gunfire, Erwin Rommel after D-Day complained, "The effect of heavy naval guns is so immense that no operation of any kind is possible in the area commanded by this rapid-fire artillery, either by infantry or by tanks." By the way, the Navy helped the Army get across the Rhine River, as well as get ashore in German-occupied France. And the support that he submitted to the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, in 1945, Ernest King, Fleet Admiral King, concluded, "The war in Europe was primarily a ground and air war with naval support." And then he added, "The war in the Pacific was primarily a naval war with ground and air support." I find this judgment in both theaters judicious. To turn to the Pacific for just a second. In 1942, at the beginning of that year, the Japanese Navy was approximately 80% of the strength of the United States Navy. They gave us a hard time early. We start to come back at Coral Sea and then, of course, at Midway and at Guadalcanal. After that is one success after another for the United States Navy. As the ships pour out of the shipyards, the United States Navy develops this overwhelming power. Some of you certainly know of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in which the Japanese, by one count, the Japanese lose in air-to-air combat 390 planes. The United States Navy loses 19, a 20-to-1 superiority. Some of that is due to the submarines, American submarines, which after fixing doctrinal problems and fixing the torpedo problems, American submarines begin to sink Japanese tankers to such a degree that Japan is unable to train its aviators, its new aviators. For example, by 1944, the average Japanese aviator committed to combat had 75 hours flying time, 50 hours in primary types and 25 hours in advanced types. The average American committed to combat for the first time had over 300 hours flying time, 50 hours in primary types and the rest in advanced types. And the result is quite obvious. I might mention that the types of aircraft the United States Navy was flying in 1944 were all new, too. That is, they were they've been planned oftentimes before the war, but they were new now. The Hellcat, the TBF. Landings, they're no Gallipolis. There are no DEPs in the Pacific. I should mention there are 26 Army landings against 15 Marine Corps landings, but every one of them is successful, every single one. By 1945, I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to the essential logistical underpinnings for this great force, for Big Blue, for the great task forces. The service force, the fleet train, enabled the United States Navy to remain at sea for lengthy periods of time. When the battleship Iowa transited the Panama Canal in January 1944, not a single man from that ship set foot on land until the next December, January to December. That, to use 1990s Air Force lingo, that's global reach, global power. When the end of the war came, there were 2 active Japanese ships of destroyer size or above. One was the oddly named Japanese destroyer, the Kamikaze. Right. The rest of the Navy had been reduced to a scattering of fugitives. This once magnificent Navy. And by 1945, by VJ Day, the United States Navy was bigger than all the rest of the navies in the world combined. In fact, it was so large and so powerful that its very raison d'etre was called into question with the defeat of the Japanese Navy. What was the Russian Navy like? What would the U.S. Navy face after VJ Day? But it had triumphed in a way unprecedented in modern warfare. Thank you.
Mike Dubler will be our third and last speaker, but I want to flash Mike's latest book, The National Guard and the War on Terror, the attacks of 9/11 and Homeland Security. I've heard a rumor, however, that they're having trouble getting people to write about the Guard in Louisiana for some peculiar reason, but I'm sure that that'll be accomplished sometime soon. Mike?
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Dubler, and I have an announcement to make. I am the unluckiest historian in the world. Every time I go to a conference like this, and I'm always glad to be invited, because especially here, because it's such a great event, I am always the last person to speak on a panel for some reason. And I have followed these three great historians and their presentations. And I have to tell you, my unluckiest moment was in 1989 at the Quantico Marine Base, when I had the unfortunate circumstance of following Dr. Stephen Ambrose. And Mrs. Ambrose, I want to tell you, I learned something that day. Your husband got up and gave the most brilliant talk about General Eisenhower. And as I listened to that, I determined that was going to be my standard in the future for giving presentations. And I want to let you know, Hugh, you and your mother, that your father still has a great influence on all of us historians. And I want to thank you for supporting him. We've heard about the contributions of air power and sea power, and let me cut to the chase. I believe it was the fighting power, the combat power of the American GI and our Marines that was the decisive element in the fighting in World War II. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Let me illustrate this point with just a short story. On the night of December 19th, 1944, in a cold, dark dugout on the southern slope of the Elsenborn Ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniel, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry of the Big Red 1, met with his company commanders. The situation was desperate. They had no idea really what was going on across the Ardennes. They only knew that a huge, unprecedented German attack had been launched 48 hours before. The American High Command had grasped this single battalion and thrown them forward onto the southern slope of the Elsenborn with a mission in that sector of stopping the German advance. All they knew is they were going to be outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1 whenever the Germans struck, which they did the next morning. Colonel Daniel looked at his company commanders and established a motto for the fight that they knew was coming. And that motto was, "We fight and die here." You imagine the determination it took to make that kind of statement under those circumstances. Colonel Daniel was a man who knew what he was about. He had participated in all 3 amphibious assaults of the Big Red One: North Africa, Sicily, and D-Day. He had led the attack through downtown Aachen, and he had fought in the Hurtgen Forest. And what he didn't know at the time, he would go on to be one of the first American commanders to cross the Remagen Bridge. A truly remarkable man. For those of you familiar with the Civil War, he is the Joshua Chamberlain of the American Army in World War II. The Germans came the next day, and they attacked with everything they got, 2 regiments. The battle went on for almost 2 days. At the height of the battle, they overran the battalion, including Colonel Daniel's command post. And at a prearranged signal to show you how desperate they were in their planning, Colonel Daniel had told artillery commanders behind Elsenborn, 10 battalions of artillery, that if he lost radio contact with them, to open up with everything they had. And that's what they did. 10 battalions fired a massive 3-hour saturation bombardment of the German positions and the American positions. On the night of the second day, reinforcements finally arrived, a battalion of infantry, tankers, and engineers, and they were appalled at what they saw. Out of the battalion of 750 men, 250 were killed. Another 250 were wounded. They took two-thirds of the unit was casualties. Colonel Daniel won the Distinguished Service Cross, and one of his soldiers won the Medal of Honor. A Graves registration unit came up the next day and was even more appalled by what they saw on the German side. There were 47 German tanks destroyed, and littered across that narrow front on the Elsenborn Ridge were 782 Panzer Grenadiers that lay dead in the snow. The Americans had held, and therefore changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge in many ways. What did these men look like? Some of them are here with us today. Many of them have passed on. I want to take a moment of personal privilege and point out one of them to you. He joined the United States Army in the summer of 1944 and served for the next 30 years. He fought in every major battle of the United States Army since 1944. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Chinese counteroffensive in Korea, and the Tet Offensive. He's qualified to wear 3 combat patches: the 4th Armored Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 11th ACR, and he is a double recipient of the Combat Infantryman's Badge. And you never know it by looking at him, but that's why I'm going to point him out to you. He is Command Sergeant Major Robert A. Macon, and I'm glad to call him Uncle Bobby. Uncle Bobby, please stand up. For all you guys in the audience, he just turned 80, and I can tell you, he can still outdo most of us. Thanks, Sergeant Major, for being here. I appreciate it. How do you talk about land power in such a vast effort as World War II? I've decided today to talk about the American GI and the Marine and what I call the philosophy of the offensive that predominated our actions in World War II. When I begin a project as an historian, I always ask myself 2 questions. How is it possible that such an event happened? I just came across this in my recent research. On the morning of September the 11th, 2001, there were 14 fighter aircraft assigned to defend the United States against aerial attack. 14. By the night of September the 11th, 2001, there were 750 on standby. How is that possible? The other thing I asked myself is, what were the participants thinking at the time? Because sometimes we forget about that. Their thoughts determine their actions, and that's what I want to talk about today, with a philosophy of the offensive. We had such a philosophy in World War II that predominated all of the thinking of the American High Command and down to all the ranks to the lowest privates. In other words, General George C. Marshall was thinking about what I'm going to tell you, as well as the lowest private in the foxhole in France and the youngest Marine on the beaches of Tarawa and so on. There were three parts of this philosophy that I want to tell you about. The first part of it was simply this: we must get the war over with as quickly as possible. There was an inherent belief that the sooner we got the war over with, the lesser would be our own casualties. Now, you might say that's intuitively obvious, but it's not. We've had different philosophies in other wars. But for World War II, this great global conflict, our ground forces were determined to get it over with as quickly as possible. Now, how did this affect our thinking strategically? It resulted in a number of major decisions. The first was that we would open up the second front as soon as possible. General Eisenhower wrote right after Pearl Harbor that we've got to stop screwing around, he said. We're wasting time. We've got to get our troops deployed. We've got to get to Europe, hit them with air power, win the Battle of the Atlantic, and open the second front up. When our initial planning staffs went to London in 1942, our good British allies looked at them and said, "Oh my God, here come the American cowboys," with their optimism and their hope to get the war over with, much like General Pershing's staff had done. We made a huge mistake with our planning in the summer of 1942, and that was that we were intent on crossing the channel as soon as possible. The British looked at us as the cowboys who were oversexed, overfed, overpaid, and over here. And we made the huge, we call it a PR blunder today. We call this project, the impending invasion, Operation Roundup. We're going to get the British thought we're going to get our lassos out with our chaps on, and we were going to take out the Germans as quickly as possible. Our British allies were 100% right. We were not ready for that, and therefore the road to Berlin began in North Africa, to Sicily, to Italy, and finally in 1944 to the beaches of Normandy. The same was true. This effort to get with the enemy and destroy him as quickly as possible predominated thinking in the Pacific to some extent. In other words, get to Guadalcanal, protect the sea lanes to Australia. In Australia, General MacArthur starts slinging back at New Guinea, and so on. Get action going. How did this thinking affect our fighting personnel? For the individual, you have to remember the war was looked upon as a huge disruption to their lives. They had come through the Great Depression. They wanted to open their own businesses. They wanted to start their own families. And they had, like I said, they'd been through the Great Depression. They thought they were going to have this opportunity, and they didn't. We had this 5-year war we had to deal with. On to Berlin, on to Tokyo. To the American fighting man, those were not slogans of victory. It was an action plan. Because they knew the only way, their ultimate goal was not victory, but was to survive and to get home. And the only way they could do it was making a stop in Berlin or making that stop in Tokyo and returning home. The second part of this philosophy of the offensive was to maximize enemy casualties. There was an understanding that the more of our enemy that we hurt and the sooner we did it, the faster the war would be over and few of our own people would be killed or wounded. Obvious examples of this are the strategic bombing campaign that Wick talked about earlier, and ultimately the use of the atomic bomb. But this thinking of maximizing enemy casualties also had an effect on our ground forces. And it was simply this: if the enemy shoots at us with a pistol, we're going to shoot back with a rifle. If they shoot with a rifle, we're going to shoot back with a machine gun. If they shoot with a machine gun, we're going to shoot back with one of those tanks. And if they fire one artillery piece at us, we're going to fire a battalion back at them. That came to predominate our thinking. Let me just mention one thing that's not well known, but it was extremely popular in both fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe in World War II, and that was the growing reliance upon high explosives that our soldiers and Marines used, and it took many forms. C4 explosives, dynamite. In Europe, our troops loved to find dynamite on a local economy from building companies and so on. The Bangalore torpedo, our flame weapons that were used in the Pacific and in Europe. And our GIs had to learn how to do all this. And I got to tell you one quick story briefly that was one of my favorites from my research. The 29th Division was attacking through the city of Brest during the Brest campaign, and they realized they were learning about city combat. And when you fight in street combat, the last place you can be is on the street. It's just too deadly. It's swept with fire, you're exposed, and so on. So they learned we had to attack through buildings. How are we going to do that? You used explosives. One battalion one day came up on a chateau-type townhouse in Brest, and on top of the roof was a German machine gun nest protected by a dozen infantrymen that held up their advance. And they got the idea that we're going to get some explosives, and we're going to fix these guys. We're going to go in, and we're going to blow out the bottom wall of this chateau so we can run in there and then go up and clean out this machine gun nest. Well, they get this dynamite, and they're sitting there looking there and saying, okay, we have 10 sticks of dynamite. Does anybody know how many we're supposed to use? Well, maybe 5. And one guy said, no, let's just go, we got them, let's use them, see what happens. They rush in there under fire, they plant the explosives. One guy knew how to do that. They backed off to a safety zone. They took that plunging device. The Germans were firing furiously. They took that plunging device, cranked it once, twice, and on the third time, those 10 sticks of dynamite went off. And when it did, it looked like a modern implosion scene. The whole bottom part of the building fell out, and the entire building, right before their eyes, collapsed right down onto itself, taking all the Germans with it. Those GIs looked at each other and said, that worked pretty good. But I think next time we're going to use 5 sticks. We can get by with that. This is an example of burning, blasting, and bulldozing our enemy into submission. The last point I want to mention briefly of this philosophy of the offensive is, and it's truly an American trait, is to minimize our own losses. The goal here was to reduce our casualties as much as possible, consistent with getting the mission done. However, this did not mean that the Army and Marine Corps were casualty adverse. There was a widespread recognition in World War II, especially in the Army. There was a quote, you see it everywhere in the records and in the official reports, that it cost casualties to take objectives. And the Army encouraged its leaders, especially at the small unit level, to understand that and to accept it. That your men are going to get killed and wounded as we press forward toward the final objective. However, it did not mean that we were supposed to take excessive risk that might not pay off and might add to more casualties on our side. And examples of this are the failure to close the Falaise-Argentan gap at the end of the Normandy campaign. And the most prominent, I think, is General Eisenhower's decision to advance on a broad front, which I believe was the correct decision instead of the single thrust into Germany by General Patton or Field Marshal Montgomery, who, by the way, believed only their single thrust would be the one that would successfully end the war. There was a pragmatic purpose to and to the philosophy of minimizing our own losses. And that is simply this, and it's a fact that's not well understood in our study of World War II, is that we were running out of people. We simply were by that time of the war, and we had to conserve our manpower. Our GIs and Marines fought with confidence, knowing they were backed up by the arsenal of democracy and the full support of the American people. There was a 2-ocean Navy with them, and air forces of bombers and fighters. But that did not make their task any easier. Sea power and air power surely made key contributions, but in my opinion, it was the fighting power of the American GI and the U.S. Marine was the decisive element in the final victory. And that is my story, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you.
Thanks to the expertise and discipline of our panel, we have plenty of time for questions. We have microphones well placed. If you can come forward and ask your question, and it'd be helpful probably if you would address one of the speakers specifically in the areas of their expertise. I will answer Marine Corps questions because I trust none of them to do that adequately. But yes, sir.
I'd like to address this question to the panel. Mr. Murray said a few things about Hitler and as he opened up his speech. Of course, I'm too young to be involved with World War II, but Was Hitler ever on the same page as his military commanders throughout the whole war effort in Europe?
Completely. I mean, the only people who had voiced any kinds of objection to Hitler's megalomaniacal dreams, and they weren't all that vociferous in their objections, were Fritz and Beck, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army and the Chief of Staff. And really from 1938 on, the German military were, particularly at the higher ranks, were enthusiastic supporters of the Fuhrer, right to the bitter end. Helped, of course, by the fact, as Professor Weinberg pointed out to all of us about, I guess, I don't want to say how many years ago, because both he and I probably don't want to remember, but Hitler provided his field marshals with huge donatives, quite literally bribes, if you want to be honest about it. And in terms of their level of strategic wisdom as opposed to the Fuhrer's level of strategic wisdom, it's worth noting that Field Marshal Manstein took his donative and the family fortune and bought a farm in East Prussia in October of 1944, which seems to have been somewhat, he got a very good price, I think it's worth noting. I think the best way to put it is that not only did the German military not understand logistics and intelligence, they also didn't understand strategy. When it was all over, of course, as Professor Weinberg quite correctly mentioned, a lot of the memoirs written by German generals like Guderian and Manstein arrived in the English-speaking world sort of with the theme of if the Fuhrer had only listened to me, and again I have to attribute this to Professor Weinberg, they never of course completed that statement. If the Fuhrer had only listened to me, the war would have lasted another 6 months and the Americans would have dropped the atomic bomb on us.
The second part of my question is Hitler's mental capability. I think it would be safe to assume from the time he wrote Mein Kampf, he was pretty much a psychopath throughout his life. I can't. Would
do a misjudgment to history to underestimate that this man was an enormously effective politician with some real strategic insights about the weaknesses of his opponents and about the possibilities that the European continent offered in the mid to late 1930s. And without that genius, that incredibly evil genius, Germany would not have gotten nearly as far as she did. Of course, in the end, that megalomania and paranoia and everything mixed in that made Hitler the person that he was, guaranteed German defeat as well.
I read two statements he made similar. The first that his commander was surrendering 300,000 German Wehrmacht troops in North Africa, that Hitler made the statement that if this is how my German army and military is going to fight this war and is not superior to the enemy, that Germany should go down and be wiped off the face of this, the people, and Germany should go down and be wiped off the face of this map, and then made that remark as the Allies' invasion had succeeded in Normandy. Do you recollect a statement like that?
Particularly in 1945, it wasn't so much in reference to North Africa, it was in reference to the fact that the Soviets were clearly going to win this war, and Hitler's attitude was clearly the German people were going to deserve the fate they were going to get, which, had there been real justice in the world, there would have been about 6 or 7 million German war criminals hanged. But luckily for the Germans, there wasn't justice in this world.
We need to move on, please, sir. Mrs. Ambrose?
Well, thank you all for being here and for giving us such a wonderful afternoon. Dr. Murray, would you be kind enough to expatiate on the moment when the assembled hierarchy of the German army couldn't find Pearl Harbor?
Well, in fairness to the German army, neither could the German naval officers or Luftwaffe officers find Pearl Harbor. I mean, the army at least was in Russia.
Yes, ma'am.
I had a question for Dr. Williamson. As you know, the Gray Commission after the war studied the effectiveness of the Strategic Air Command, and their conclusion was that the air war had not been run very well, that the Army Air Corps had really spent most of the war trying to figure out how to fight the air war. And I'm just wondering why you tend to disagree with the Gray Commission.
The Strategic Bombing Survey is a very interesting document. The front sections of it were written by somebody who, John Kenneth Galbraith, who decided that strategic bombing didn't work and kind of put that in the first opening pages. Thereafter, all of the evidence that comes up, particularly in the supporting volumes, but also in the first volume, makes it very clear that strategic bombing had a huge impact on the Germans. And again, part of the problem, of course, is that it was written very quickly at the end of the Second World War. It did not look at the impact of strategic bombing on the military side of the equation, so all sorts of crucial issues were left out of its discussions. It's a wonderful source document, but one should take it for what it is, which is something written in the immediate aftermath of a unbelievably large conflict, dealing with an incredibly complex subject of which there were going to be no clear answers. But I think the best way to sort of characterize one of the major contributions to strategic bombing was we were able to have B-24s roll out of the Willow Run factory 2 miles long. The Germans were forced to build their airplanes in pieces, in tunnels, and spread out in the open because all of their factories were being wrecked and destroyed.
Follow-up question, if I could. The Gray Commission report says pretty thoroughly what the German war production numbers were. And the war production numbers actually went up. I mean, these nice folks created a jet plane and a couple of other weapons while we were bombing them. And the report says very clearly it's because we destroyed factories, but we didn't destroy machinery.
Well, there were some cases of that, but in fact, it's very clear that strategic bombing in terms of the German war production restrained German war production. If you look at the curves of American production in 42 and 43 and 44, you see a curve going like this. You see the German curve looking like this. And there are some very large distortive figures because figures lie and liars figure. The supposed huge increase in German production in 1944 reflected the fact that the Germans, in fact, given the desperate situation confronting the Luftwaffe in 1944, switched from bomber production to fighter production. You can produce, in fact, about 2.5 fighters for every bomber that you produce. And the result was that, in fact, in 1944, where the Germans had hoped to double their production in terms of weight of aircraft produced, they only managed a 20% increase, which suggests a massive retarding influence on German production, which of course was taking place. Again, did it accomplish everything that the ideologues who supported strategic bombing suggested it would? No, but it achieved far, far more than John Kenneth Galbraith and those who claim that it had no impact. Only people who don't bother to read documents and the real facts can still argue that position.
Let me add something, if I might. We had a career Air Force officer on Ohio State who did a very long and tedious, at least from my standpoint, dissertation on target acquisition in the strategic bomber forces in the European theater. And target acquisition and bomb damage assessment is a tricky business, certainly at best. But he did, drawing on his own personal experience, having done that work in a couple of wars, I think did a pretty thorough job. And he pointed out that the critical thing is changing the targeting, that there were various pressures to bomb certain kinds of economic assets that continued to change. And so that, in a sense, they didn't get it right in terms of targeting until 1944, when they went back to what had actually had been identified in the 1930s as the critical target set, which was the power grid in Germany, the transportation system, petrochemical refineries, anything that was related to energy. So what that meant then, essentially, was that you could make all the Panther tanks or, PK-5, whatever, and if they couldn't run because they didn't have any gasoline, or you couldn't move them from where they were being stored and built, then it represented no real combat capability. And it's true that while you might follow the tank production numbers, which only drop off late in the war, they were all sitting around in great big parking lots and not getting to the troops who might otherwise have used them. Another aspect of all this that's usually not talked about is the fact that the German population, until about the last 5 months of the war, was probably the best fed population of all the belligerents, because Hitler never cut back on food supply, kept it very high. They finally dropped down about 1,800 calories a day, which is somebody's diet, I'm sure. But even then, the country people in Germany were relatively well fed, but there was no transportation system that was adequate enough to get the food to the people who were all German citizens, obviously not slave laborers, who were in the cities producing the weapons. So that the bombing, in a sense, also began to disrupt the social fabric of Germany in ways that, quite frankly, had probably not been anticipated, but was nevertheless quite real. Let's take another question over here.
Dr. Murray, you pointed out that the Germans, in your opinion, were appallingly bad in logistics and intelligence. I was wondering if you'd be good enough to point out a couple of more egregious examples of that, sir.
Egregious examples? Paulus, who was operations G3 in the OKH in 1940, in October 40, ran a logistics game which indicated that you could get, the German logistical system could get 2/3 of the way to Moscow, 2/3 of the way to Leningrad, and barely to the Ukraine. A fairly significant piece of logistical wisdom which nobody paid any attention to until they got in mid-July 2/3 of the way and discovered that the Panzer divisions at the lead edges had no fuel, no ammunition, and they were barely able to keep them from being overrun by fourth-rate Soviet reserve. And again, another example in terms of logistical genius is the fact that Operation Typhoon against Moscow, launched in early October of 1941, the logistician said, if you launch this offensive, we can bring up the fuel and ammunition to support it, to drive on Moscow, but there will be no buildup of supply dumps for the winter, no winter clothing, and no winter fuels to deal with the temperatures we all know are coming. And the attitude of the senior leadership is best summed up by General Halder, who in a meeting of chiefs of staff on the Eastern Front in mid-November 1941, with the mud period coming to an end and the ground freezing over, but freezing over because temperatures were now dropping to sort of 10 degrees and headed clearly down to below zero in the near future. Halder said, it's good that we're getting this hard freeze so our mobile divisions can move forward, and hopefully it won't snow until mid-January. As far as intelligence, the fact that the Germans had their codes read by both us and the Soviets through the whole Second World War should suggest a certain major deficiency in intelligence, not to mention the whole Maskarovka deception effort of the Soviets, in which from 1942 on, every single major Soviet offensive was covered by Maskarovka operations and caught the Germans by surprise. You'd think after 10 or 12 times in a row, the Germans might have said, there's something wrong with our intelligence, but they don't. That's because they didn't care, and the results are clear.
I can't help observing when I was in ROTC some 50 years ago, I was told the field artillery is the branch to be in because everybody got to ride. And so I was startled to learn a few years ago that during World War II, even up to the end, the Germans were pulling artillery with horses. Anyway, my question is, a year or so ago, I ordered a course by a very eminent professor on Russian history. This is the wrong venue to ask this question, I suppose, but he said basically the war in Europe was won not by D-Day, but by the Russian battle at Kursk, the tank battle, which Professor Dilber, I suppose, would like to comment on that?
Well, it's clear that in the aggregate, the Soviet Army did the lion's share of the damage to the Wehrmacht. I mean, you can't deny that. But I don't think you can then say the exact opposite is true, that we had no effect. I think that we did. To a very large extent. I think, to me, for the German army in the West, I call it the efficiency curve. The efficiency curve of the two armies, us on the rise, the Germans on the decline, probably crossed somewhere around D-Day. And I think after that we were learning and building our forces up. About mechanization, I always like to point out that you always hear about the German blitzkrieg and what the Soviets did, and in terms of mechanization and doctrine to support that, the most advanced fighting force on the planet in terms of mechanization and doctrine and firepower maneuver at the end of World War II was the American Armored Division. That was the one fighting force that, to go back to your original question, everyone rode, was either on a track or on a wheel. And the Germans were still using horses. This surprised the dickens out of our forces during the counterattack into the Ardennes, that they were finding roads littered with wagons and horses that our airplanes had shot up, our artillery had gone after. And they were saying, you know, God, this really means these guys are on the run. Well, it meant that, but it also meant that that's the way they did it. And so yes, obviously the Soviets did a tremendous amount of damage and did the lion's share of the killing of the German army, but the other allies, I don't want to say finished off, it was substantial as well.
Over here, please.
First of all, thank you for joining us for this conference, and thank you to the museum for hosting us. My question is not so much on the fighting side, but the organizational side, and I wondered if any one of you would comment. My question is, how did the policymakers in Washington and the service chiefs decide how to organize and equip their different services? How did they figure how many battleships they needed? How did they decide how many troops they needed? How many 500-pound bombs needed to be made and shipped across the ocean before they realized that they were doing something right or wrong?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that and let you guys follow up. I think we did an extraordinary job, and the reason we did an extraordinary job, how exactly, is undoubtedly an incredibly boring, dull story that most of us up here don't want to get into. But the crucial difference is that both the Army and the Navy were willing to bring civilian experts, particularly production experts, into the whole processes of building up the logistical and productive support required not only to build the stuff but to project the stuff, so that and I think one of the major deficiencies that we confront today is precisely our incapacity, because of the size of the military and DoD bureaucracy, to bring in outside experts to really change how business is done. But the projection of military force, it's not just a matter of how many bombs you need, but getting the bombs where you need them, and getting the ships where you need them, and getting the airplanes where you need them. And that was if you will, a triumph of American production know-how and knowledge that went through the business side of things, because of course major corporations in the U.S. had to deal with a continental business structure, including Canada, and that was transferred to getting it around the world.
I might add that, for better or for worse, the relationship between the military and American business, corporate business in World War two was extremely close. Lieutenant General Knudsen was actually the former president of General Motors, and there were all kinds of dollar-of-the-year men, whether they were in uniform or whether they were civilians, who were integrated into the Army Service Forces, of which my father, in fact, was a key member, I think. At least he told me he was.
I want to tell.
Let me just.
No, I think that there are some folks who think that that was an unholy alliance and then went on much too long after the war. From the Defense Department side today, the feeling is there isn't enough of that collaboration. We have to offshore stuff, and that we're working on a very, very thin American industrial base to keep the American Armed Forces functioning. Now, the latest is that the official BAE, which is fundamentally an arm of the British government, was privatized. That's their arms industry. They now do more business with the United States than they do any other services, and so BAE wants to become an American corporation, which is, we find quite novel. I suspect we'll get to the point where we hire out Chinese firms to make weapons, which we will then use perhaps someday against the Chinese. I happen to know an Air Force officer was selling Lockheed missiles in Beijing, and I said, I hope you give them the bad ones. But it's a much different situation today. Mike?
I want to just tell one quick story that always made a big impression on me. We talk about American industrial capacity and the planning that went with it, and that's all true, but part of the genius of what we did in World War II was not only to produce those materials, but to project them and then sustain them after they were there. And after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, one of our debacles in World War II, the German Panzer Grenadiers went through and sacked what was left of some of the American units on the battlefield. And in the back of a half-track or a truck or something, they came across a box, which they opened. They'd come through the APO system, and it was a cake that a mother had baked in Iowa and sent to her son in North Africa. And the Germans were so astounded by this, they took it to General Rommel. And they opened this cake. It's just a German general looking at this cake. And Rommel wrote in his memoirs later on, when he saw that cake that had come from Iowa to North Africa, he knew it was all over.
In fact, the cake was still fresh.
Cake was still fresh.
And he said, any army that can send fresh cakes from mothers, he said, I don't know how we're going to match them, in terms of material. Yes, sir.
My name is Max Marco, and the first thing I'd like to ask is a question. I'd like to ask a question. If there are any members here that served with the 29th Division, as I did, would you please stand up? There he is.
There's one.
Very good.
Well, 29th Division and the 1st Division were on the beaches first, and I think we got the most casualties. Another statement that I'd like to make is, you gentlemen, were you fortunate or unfortunate enough to see the D-Day celebrations, the 50th and the 60th, with Stephen Ambrose and his son following him? Excuse me. Anybody here?
I saw the 50th.
Thank
you.
you.
No, 60th.
Thank you.
60th.
I'd like to tell you something about a few of my experiences, and then I'd like to ask some questions. Shall I ask the questions first or last?
Yes, please.
Question?
Ask the question first.
You talked about being in Brest. Well, the 29th Division, you mentioned that also, thank you. We were at Brest, and you said something about the bombing or the air. How did you connect it with how we operated at Brest?
The use of explosives by our troops on the ground.
Well, we were there, the 29th Division.
Absolutely.
And the most powerful force that we could use on them, because they were so well protected from the concrete walls and they were down at sea level, where their submarines could come in over a pen like this so you couldn't see them on the air. Okay, and the forces dropped bombs there. The bombs bounced off. And we had to go there and literally burn them out.
Yes.
We burned them out with flamethrowers at the entrance. And that, I don't know if you were aware of that, but I'd like to add that to your comments.
I appreciate that.
And you did say something about flamethrowers
Yes.
here or something over there.
Absolutely.
I was not a flamethrower.
Maybe we take
Starting from the beginning again, excuse me, starting from the beginning again, that's not the right choice of words. But have you ever heard about the St. Lo breakthrough?
I surely have.
Good, then you probably know more about it than I do, because I came through after the major of the St. Lo breakthrough was put on the steps of the church in his coffin.
Yeah.
And the troops went through the streets.
Yes.
Everybody loved that major, which we can't say about every sergeant or general or whatever, except for General Cota, who took us off the beaches.
I have been to that church and stood where his body was placed, so I'm well aware of it. Thank you.
Okay. I told you about Brest, and I told you about the Major St. Lo, and I told you about the flamethrowers. But what you didn't cover is how important the tanks, the artillery, and the medics performed and saved so many lives, mostly American, and my brother-in-law, German. He was a medic, and he received the Silver Star. He's alive. He's a physician in Long Beach, California. I was born in Los Angeles. And I think you should give some comments about the tanks, the artillery, and the medics. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just say briefly that, thank you. I talked about the philosophy of the offensive, just to talk about the war at the broadest level. Clearly, the use of our combined arms team, which is our tanks, artillery, the infantry, engineers, the whole thing, including our medical support, was the key to the victory, and we recognized it at the time. Our leaders and the troops knew that without bringing all of our resources to bear, there was no way we could ever overcome the enemy, and that's exactly what we did. And I would recommend to you the book Closing with the Enemy that I've written that talks about all that in detail, including the 29th Division.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I would address this to all of you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the effects that the environment had since this was a world war, and say troops went from Kiska to the Marshall Islands and then maybe to North Africa and then on to Normandy, the effects it had both on the men and the equipment, where there were successes and failures because equipment was maybe retrofitted to work, say, in Alaska that didn't work elsewhere.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was quite interesting about the war, and I dealt with this in the book that Wick and I wrote, was simply that, first of all, the United States Army and Naval Medical Services were able to treat people and return them to duty at rates that were astounding compared with the medical services of other military establishments. That goes all the way from the medics on the battlefield to trauma care and rapid evacuation. First helicopter evacuation of casualties took place in Luzon, 1945, not Korea. So there was a huge medical story, and part of it also has to do with the prevention of losing forces to epidemic disease. That the medical services, in fact, tackled respiratory diseases principally, and were enormously successful in cutting back losses from respiratory diseases, which have been a plague on the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Much of the early problems, in some cases, had to do with packaging. So that if you sent things to the South Pacific or you sent them to Africa, you found out very quickly that under the local conditions, the weather and the like, they deteriorated very badly. And so everything had to be packaged in such a way to protect it either from dust or from moisture or from bad handling, which was always a problem. Many of you remember C rations, I'm sure. They were designed basically to be survivable. It didn't mean they were edible, it just meant they were survivable. And that you could be relatively certain that something was inside that case-hardened EMP can. generations now have been raised on MREs, I always bring some C rations to class and show them C ration. Oh, you know, what do you open that with? Can opener around neck, you know, and with dog tags. Wow, you know, that's clever jewelry. You know, I mean, whatever they think. But very often we overlook the fact, you know, again, that we're projecting these huge forces overseas with this tremendous logistical system behind them, and having to move people and things, machinery, you know, vast distances, and then operate them in an extremely hostile physical environment. And I think most of you know that we're still recovering bodies from World War II, and at the moment they're being dug out of Burma, India, New Guinea, where their planes went down by the 10s and 20s. But that's a whole side of the war sometimes it's overlooked because it's dull and boring, and it's not sexy, but it's clearly very important. Yes, sir.
For Dr. Muir, what's your opinion first on Halsey's action in the battle for Leyte Gulf? And secondly, why with Iwo and Okinawa, our battleships didn't use armor-piercing shells to blow up the below-ground installations of the Japanese, like we blew up the railroad tunnels from the Missouri in North Korea, because they go 40 feet into the ground before they'd explode.
To take the second question first, why didn't we use armor-piercing rounds in quantity at Iwo Jima and Okinawa? The old battleships, which were the champion gunfire support ships, were loaded out with high-capacity ammunition, that is bombardment ammunition. They had a small ration of armor-piercing rounds. So the problem was the ships were essentially configured to support the kind of landings that have been taking place at Kwajalein and Saipan. We didn't realize how deep the Japanese were going to dig. A 16-inch armor-piercing round would go through 30 feet of reinforced concrete, so in fact it was fairly impressive. It didn't have much of a bursting charge. It had a 45-pound bursting charge, so it was really a large shot as opposed to a shell. The first question, Halsey at Leyte Gulf, it's been said it's too bad that Halsey wasn't in command at the Philippine Sea when Spruance played a cautious hand and didn't rush out and try to grab the Japanese fleet. And conversely, it's too bad that Spruance, a cautious man, wasn't at Leyte Gulf, but because he would never have left San Bernardino Strait uncovered.
Halsey did.
Halsey's actions at Leyte Gulf are absolutely rash.
Chase.
He takes the entire Big Blue, every single ship. He doesn't leave a destroyer in front of San Bernardino Strait and rushes up after the toothless carriers of Ozawa. A major mistake, no question.
Yeah, along those lines, just let me add that from my point of view, what little I know about naval history, the mission of both Spruance and Halsey was to protect the landing. That was what they were there to do, and Spruance did, and Halsey didn't. And it's very simple as that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Dr. Murray, would you comment on General Jimmy Doolittle and how he changed the policy of the 8th Air Force and went about destruction of the Luftwaffe?
Yeah, Jimmy Doolittle, I think both Alan and I think is the premier American airman of the Second World War. He and Spots were brought in very clearly, I think, to replace Aker after Aker's, and I wouldn't say failure, because Aker faced some really major problems in 1943 which were insoluble, namely that you didn't have long-range escort. I think Aker's replacement, however, reflected the fact that Aker persisted in a course which very clearly the bombings of June, July, and August made clear was just simply not in the cards. And the Black Week that 8th Air Force had in October 1943, where it lost nearly 50% of its airplanes and crews, was a significant defeat that got Akers shuffled out of the theater. I think very clearly what Doolittle understood, and his major contribution was that almost from the first, certainly by March 1944, he understood that the target was the Luftwaffe. And the release of the fighters, which the bomber cruisers weren't real happy about, but the release of the fighters to go after the German fighters represented a larger understanding of the air war. And that's why he deserves credit for being a great airman.
In New Orleans, we call that the Reggie Bush strategy, which is the high-price decoy.
I flew on that first mission. I flew on that first mission that after Doolittle took command, he sent up 650 bombers. We lost 60, but I think we destroyed twice that many German fighters. And I think that mission really transformed the air war.
This is for Dr. Murray. In your opinion, what were the 5 most influential types of Allied aircraft during World War II and why?
5 most influential. Well, clearly one of them is right there, Spitfire. Yeah, I suppose again in terms of not necessarily because of its combat dropping paratroopers, but because of its support in terms of the whole logistical structure that included large numbers of C-47s throughout all the various theaters we fought. I would definitely have to put a B-17 there, and I would put the Lancaster there, and I'd put the P-51 there. That would be my selection of aircraft.
We have time for one more question. Ma'am?
Well, I think it's appropriate. This is probably the last question. What if the Axis would have stayed together, or even if Hitler would have overcome the Russians, but the Japanese would have won, what would have happened next to all of us? You know, I know it's an educated guess. It has to be because no one really knows, but I was just curious to what you what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, again, I think we have to understand that we were dealing with, in the Second World War, 3 criminal regimes that were planning to steal not just from the rest of the world, but from each other, if necessity came to it, and had no desire really to cooperate with each other in any fashion. Again, I agree entirely with Professor Weinberg's comments that the real mistake the Japanese made was in April of 1942 not to follow up their Ceylon efforts to come in the back door behind the Germans. And even if it represented too much of a logistical leap, it would have put such huge pressure on the British position in the Middle East. But again, these people were incapable of cooperating with each other, and they went down to defeat separately. Thank goodness. The difference, of course, was that the Soviets were no more helpful to us and the Brits, but at least in terms of the American-British alliance, there were, from the very highest levels on down, a willingness to work together, even though, from the point of view of the Brits, we were a bunch of cowboys who didn't know our proper place in the world. And from our point of view, many of the Brits were arrogant snobs. My wife, who's British, often reminds me.
You call her an arrogant snob.
No, I behave myself. But her comment, which she says in jest, but a certain amount of truth in it, is that America is the first nation to go from barbarism straight to degeneracy, skipping civilization.
I'm not sure that's a high point or a low point. I want to thank all of you for being a wonderful audience, engaged. We really appreciate that. We will be in the rear hawking our books, so if you have more questions individually, we'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Uh,